Hey guys, this is Brittany from Brittany Goldwyn. I post videos about plants and projects, and the goal of today's video is to convince you to grow some more sage in your garden. One of the reasons why I love growing sage all over my garden is because it is perennial where I live. At least the types of sage I grow are perennial where I live in Maryland Zone 7A. I love relying more and more on perennials in my garden because it means they will come back year after year and they require very little maintenance. I don't have to buy them every spring. I just know that they are going to be a staple in my garden year after year that I can plant around. I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits of having sage in your garden. I have a nice little sage right here behind me. This is one of my newer plants that I have in my garden. This one actually started as a propagation from one of my larger sage plants, and we will go into the ease of propagating sage in this video in a little bit. But first, we're going to walk around and we're going to talk about some of the benefits of it. First, I mentioned the fact that a lot of the sage I grow here in Maryland Zone 7A is perennial. That means it comes back year after year, which I absolutely love. I love relying more and more on perennials because they require less water, less maintenance, almost no fertilizer. They really just kind of take care of themselves aside from some minor pruning every year. So a big benefit of sage is that it is reliable. It also has a very distinct smell that you're either a big fan of or you're not a fan of. I personally am a big fan of the way sage smells, but even if you're not, know that that super strong smell in your garden could be helpful for some integrated pest management and deterring some pests from your garden. So some critters and things may not like the strong smell of sage, so they either won't bother it, they'll leave it alone. The groundhogs in the back completely ignore the sage I have planted there, or they may just think, I'm gonna go chomp on another plant if there's sage nearby that's kind of giving off that strong scent that they don't like. So it can help protect plants that would otherwise be vulnerable to critters in your garden. Now, given the fact that sage is so low maintenance, it can make a really great plant to put in areas that are kind of harder to plant in. So, for example, we put this pond in last year, and I've been working on adding more sustainable landscaping all around the pond. So I focus mostly on native plants and perennials. You see I've got coneflower here, I've got some lavender, I've got butterfly weeds. So I want a really nice cottage garden vibe around this pond. So what I've done over here in this weird weedy corner that I have a lot of trouble pulling the weeds in is I've planted a sage plant so that it can kind of grow wide and fill in this area around the rocks to kind of make this area look a bit more wild. I like a very manicured wild approach, if that makes sense. So sage has a nice tidy appearance, but it will also add some nice lush greenery here around the rocks in this pond. Because the types of sage that I grow are a nice lower mounding variety of sage, I can use them in areas where I want to have a nice reliable ground cover. So I'm back in my perennial garden bed right here. This started out specifically as a dedicated perennial garden bed where I would put a lot of the clearance perennials I got to rehab them and then eventually split them off and put them elsewhere in the yard. So if you can believe it, these were the first two sage plants that I ever added to my garden. I have one over here, and then I have one over here, and these were each $1, maybe less, honestly. I got these super cheap at the end of the season one fall, planted them back here, and they are coming back year after year with a vengeance. And you can see that these spread and mound really, really wonderfully to provide a nice ground cover. If we can cover up the soil, that's what we want to be doing to help to suppress weeds and to discourage growth of things that we don't want growing. So these are the plants that I have taken cuttings from to propagate all over my yard. And on that note, I'm going to cut to some footage that I filmed a couple months ago when it was a little bit earlier in the season on some sage propagations that I did, because as I said, if I have sage in my yard, it was probably propagated from one of the two plants I have in the back here. So I'm going to show you guys how to propagate that to make sure you always have an endless supply of sage. I have a ton of different sage propagations that I've been working on this spring because I want to spread sage everywhere in my yard. So in here in my little greenhouse, you can see that I have a couple. These sage plants are rooting back here. This one in the back looks like it's got some new growth on it. And then I've also got a couple trays full of tiny little sage cuttings that I picked off of those dead branches I pulled off. I have these rooting here. I didn't really put too much work into them. I just figure whatever roots will root, and then I will be able to pot it up separately, either to rehome to someone else or to just spread more throughout my yard. I have a couple more sage plants out here that are a little bit more mature in terms of how their growth is going after propagating. These three out here, they may not look too much more mature because they're quite small, but all of the leaves that you see here, except for these two on this one, which are kind of darker, those are all new growth on these plants. So that is how I know the plant has successfully rooted. It is giving me some beautiful new growth, and I will probably leave these here in these pots until I see some root growth through the holes on the bottom and a little bit more growth in the top before transplanting it. That said, these plants are super hardy and super responsive to being transplanted straight in the ground. So I had some propagations that last fall I was working on, and they were slightly rooted and it was getting a little cold out, but I figured I'm gonna go ahead and throw these in the ground before it gets too cold. They survived with no protection over the winter and barely any root system to write home about. This is what they look like bouncing back this year. Now, when I popped these in the ground last year, they only had maybe like 2 or 3 leaves, and they are rebounding quite well right now. There's a little bit of some dead growth on here that I'll just pick off, but as long as there's new healthy growth coming out and I'm seeing new growth sprout out along these stems, I know that these propagations have been a success, and soon they will spread and be a beautiful large mounding sage plant that will look really lovely filling out the spot here and covering the ground. Okay, there are obviously lots of benefits to growing sage. I've named just a couple of the reasons why I like to grow sage in my garden. There are lots and lots of different reasons to grow sage in your garden, but regardless of why you choose to grow it, you're going to have to maintain it. So I took some footage several months ago about how I cut back my sage every spring. Now, a lot of people will say that you need to maintain your sage, and a lot of that depends on what type of sage you are growing. If you're growing one of those spreading mounding varieties, like I tend to grow in my yard, then I don't do any maintenance until like super late spring every year. I let the foliage die off whenever it dies off in the winter, and then I keep it in place so it can serve as a shelter for little bugs and other critters that might need it over the winter. And then in the spring, I will completely cut back that plant to encourage the healthy new growth to come out. So generally, I'm going to be cutting that plant down pretty much to the soil surface every spring, late spring, to encourage healthy, beautiful new growth on my sage. And you might not be able to get all of the yucky growth cut away, and that's fine, because once your healthy new growth starts to emerge, it will just cover up any of that yucky growth from last year, whether it's still attached to the plant or just kind of decomposing in the ground around the sage plant. So you can see that this one at the end of the season last year had gotten so big that it kind of started to flop outward, and that happened so late in the season that I did not feel the need to do any sort of maintenance on it. I just kind of let it go all winter. And then early in the spring, I cut this completely down to the ground, and it looked a little wonky for a couple weeks, but now in mid-June, it has rebounded beautifully and looks awesome. All right, guys, that's about all I have to say about growing perennial sage in your garden today. I absolutely love having it all around the garden. It also makes a really nice addition to cut flower bouquets, especially when there aren't a ton of things blooming. It adds a really nice texture and scent to them. So just add that to the list of the many reasons why I love having it all around my garden. I really hope this has convinced you guys to add some sage to your garden. It's a super sustainable and awesome option to add to your plant lineup. And until my next video, happy planting.